and we are going to save questions for the end. And Terry's happy to address those either through chat, he'll respond live, of course, or feel free at that time to unmute yourself and speak with Terry directly. So I'm going to do a really quick intro of Terry, and many of you probably have seen Terry over the years. I know he's been a guest at our AGMs in previous years, and we're so pleased that he's here with us today. Terry was born and raised here in the county, and I have to say for myself, it's been really fun to kind of follow Terry's footsteps in terms of, his wanderings and his teachings, and I love hearing. And he's been very involved with the Conservation Authority in the past, and he's an avid birder, obviously, and nature enthusiast. And he's applied those passions over the years, both professionally and personally. And now I follow him and his four-legged sidekick, Christy, on many of their adventures and their observations as they're exploring the trails in the county and beyond the county. So, Terry, welcome to our group today, and thank you to everyone for participating. And Terry, I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be able to give this presentation to the Friends of Wellers Bay. We'll just get set up here. I'm assuming everyone can hear me all right. Okay, I'm going to start out by saying that this presentation was initially prepared for the Prince Edward County Stewardship Council some years back. I think it was 2008 when I initially did it, but for the purpose of today's presentation, I've added a few new slides, particularly at the end. We are very fortunate to live in a county that has had so many natural features like wildflowers and wildlife and natural areas, as well as cultural and historical aspects. So I'm going to attempt to touch on just a few of these, and I will say, though, that I am just scratching the surface. It was a very difficult presentation to put together to focus on some of the what I consider to be the more important areas of people that can relate to. Now, at first glance, when we speak of the county, we tend to think that it is a county of limestone rock, and indeed it is. This is Scotch Bonnet Island. You may have heard of it. You may have been on it. It's not very big. It's only about 2 acres in size, and it is almost 99% limestone slabs, like you see here. Very little soil. Any soil that's present is up there around the old lighthouse remains. This is West Point. Again, you've got the shelves of limestone rock, which is a dominant feature in the county along the shorelines, especially. And this is an area, say, on farmland locally, where you will find that the limestone bedrock is so close to the surface that there's no vegetation on it whatsoever. We call these areas alvars. This is actually a term that was borrowed from the Scandinavian countries to describe similar rock that is found there, and it seems to apply to certain areas of Ontario, in particular Prince Edward County. The entire Prince Edward County, with the exception of this little area here that I'm going to talk about, it's a limestone plateau or plain from which the glaciers, the retreat of the glaciers back 12,000 years ago, stripped much of the overburden. But in between all of this, there's some interesting bedrock geology like this one. This is the Ameliasburg Inlier. You may be familiar with it. It's not very large. In fact, if you're driving on Victoria Road, west of Highway 62, just south of Belleville, you'll probably pass by it without even realizing what you had passed. You know, if you did realize it, you'll say, hey, am I in Madoc or somewhere? You know, this shouldn't be here. The Precambrian rocks form the actual foundation of the upon which the later rocks like limestone were formed. This would be, what you're looking at here would be about 950 million years old. And this basement of metamorphic rock and granite rock is very regular to the region. Now, if you're up in the Consacon area, you had a shovel, for instance, you'd have to dig down about 700 feet before you would reach the Precambrian rock, like you see here. If you're in the sandbanks area, you'd have to dig a little further, about 1,000 feet before you'd strike it. But here, this basement just suddenly and unexplainably just rises above the surface right in Ameliusburg Township, or Ameliusburg Ward, I guess they're called now. And geologists will tell you that this is not true granite. People refer to this as granite. It's not true granite, not like the granite you would find, say, up in the Highway 7 area, that nice pink granite that we know so well. This is more of a metamorphic rock, and it's called gneiss, Gneiss. So it's not true granite. And I guess one could say that it isn't nice to be taken for granite. And if you're laughing out there, I can't hear you, but I hope you are. This is an aerial view, a Google Earth image actually, of the Ameliusburg Inlier. It's only about 13 acres. Here we have Victoria Road, and this is Hubbs Road, to give you an idea of where you are. And most of that rock is right here in this little area here. And I was always a little curious if there were any boreal species of vegetation growing here that you would normally find in the northern area, say up north of Highway 7. And there had been a few studies done, little bits and pieces here and there. But I was there a few years ago, and in the 2 hours that I was there, I did find a few plants more typical of the north, such as this fern here called polypody, which is something that you would normally find in places like Frontenac Provincial Park and Algonquin Park. It's as small as it looks. It's a little cluster, grows in little clusters, and you could actually hold that right in the palm of your hand if you were able to uproot it. And I found it growing there, and I found poverty grass growing there, and also marginal shield fern was growing there, as well as pale corygulus. Now, all of these plants probably do occur somewhere in Prince Edward County, but they're more typical of the northern regions. So, you know, it didn't surprise me to find them growing there. Now, from one extreme to the other, we go from that hard metamorphic rock that I just showed you to fine sand. This, of course, is Sandbanks Provincial Park. This is the Westlake sector, which extends from here about 8 kilometers all the way to the village of Wellington. It is actually the largest baymouth sandbar separating fresh water in the world. And you might argue that, you might say, well, I've been down to Lake Erie and I've been to Long Point Provincial Park, and it supposedly stretches out there in the lake for 40 kilometers. Well, yes, that's true. But the key thing is that this is separating two bodies of fresh water, where Long Point Peninsula and Lake Erie stretches out into the lake and doesn't separate any bodies of water at all. So it's a very important feature, a natural feature of the county. Now, with the retreat of the Wisconsin Glacier back in around 12,000 years ago, I'm just going to change my mouse here so you can see it a little better, because I have a few things to point out. Here we go. What we now call West Lake and East Lake, they were all part of what we now call Lake Ontario. And as the currents brought the sand in that was left by the retreat of those glaciers, it built up some underwater sandbars, which eventually rose above the level of the water and formed the sand dunes and the sandbars that we know today, like Outlet Park or Outlet Beach, for instance, and the sandbar that I showed you earlier. Now, what happened was that these bars eventually became very well vegetated. There was a massive white cedar forest growing there. Some of the cedars were as old as 300 years old. And if you walk up those sand dunes today, you have to go up quite a little ways to see this, you will find remnants of that white cedar forest, these almost dried up cores of wood that are still standing from that forest, because the sand had moved, covered up the trees, sand continued to move and left these petrified stumps behind. So it took more than 40 years to stop that sand movement. Early pioneers in the 1920s, and I should point out that this sand was moving. And here's a good example here. What happened was that this area was very well vegetated, as I pointed out. It was all covered with grass and cedars and other types of vegetation. And the early settlers, of course, cut down these trees in order to build their homes, and they turned their cattle out onto the dunes. So there was nothing there to hold that sand in place. And it started moving in the late 1800s and early 1900s like a giant snowdrift coming across the land. And it was covering up buildings, it was covering up roads. It covered up the Westlake Road. So this road had to be rerouted 3 different times in 50 years. And that's why if you're traveling the Westlake Road today, it takes that little snaky turn around the end of the dunes and comes out at the 4-way stop, which is about here. So it took about 40 years to stop that migration of dunes, and they planted millions and millions and millions of trees. And finally, after laying mulch and doing a lot of other things, they stopped the sand from moving, and it's becoming well vegetated once again. Another issue I should point out, or another point I should mention, is that this dotted line represents where I feel, it's not official, but it's where I feel that the original shoreline may have been. Now imagine all these dunes that you are familiar with being over here, and that's where they used to be, according to early depictions of this Westlake sandbar. And the wind took it and moved it over to here, all that sand over to here. So all that sand is in Westlake. This area in response to that turned out to be rather flat. It's an area that we call a pan. It's a type of wetland that's created when the winds take all that sand away and leave it exposed to the water table. And you're probably quite familiar with that as you're driving in to the parking lot, that this whole area is sometimes flooded through here. So it certainly has changed the look of sandbanks over the years. Now, another very important part of our natural heritage is an area that we call McMahon Bluff. This is known geologically as a mesa, M-E-S-A. It's about 240 acres in size. It rises about 150 feet. I'll give you another picture here. Gives you a better view of a shot that I took back in the fall a few years ago, showing the flat top mountain effect of this mesa. And this is something that you normally see down in the southern United States, mainly South America, where they call them tepuis down there, T-E-P-U-I, or tabletop mountain. And there's some rare plants that grow here that came to our attention. One is ginseng, but the most significant plant that grows here is a species of milkweed called 4-leaved milkweed. Asclepias quadrifolia is the Latin name if you're into scientific names. And there are only 3 other areas, or 3 areas in total in Prince Edward County where this plant grows. One is here. The other is on the plateau of Macaulay Mountain Conservation Area at Picton. And a third location was found just last year at Green Point. And it may very well be 3 of very few areas in all of Canada where this rare plant grows. So it's a very significant area. I'll get back to that briefly a little bit later on in the presentation. Now, getting back to sandbanks and the Westlake Dunes, you may think that, how can anything possibly live out here? Because any rainfall that falls percolates through the sand very quickly, and plants don't have much chance to snatch up any moisture at all that falls from the sky. So how can anything possibly live out here when the temperature in the middle of summer can reach as high as 120 degrees Fahrenheit? And you don't see much wildlife out here, but there are some interesting plants that do grow out here. And one is a beautiful little flower, a member of the forget-me-not family called hoary cocoon. And it doesn't cover the sand dunes by any means, but it grows in little decorative isolated spots, giving a little bit of color to the sand. So it blooms in June. So it grows there and has somehow adapted to living in these dry conditions. Very beautiful plant. Another one is called wormwood, and it grows all over the sand dunes. And this is one that's also called Artemisia. Cultivars you might be a little more familiar with, such as Dusty Miller and Silver Mound, which you get at the garden centers. But in its raw form, this is wormwood, and you'll see it growing in little clumps all over the place. And they have developed ways to preserve that precious moisture. They have hairy leaves, and that prevents moisture loss. Another one is Starry Falls Solomon seal. It actually has a backup plan. It produces berries once these flowers are done flowering, and these berries contain moisture-rich seeds, which, when they drop to the sand, provides just enough moisture to get those plants started. The other backup system is that it sends out rhizomes. And if you're looking at Starry Falls Solomon seal, it's a very small plant, relatively speaking. You'll see that there will be a string of them, a line of them where they've produced young, and the plants are living off the parent plant until it can get on its own. I just noticed that there. I think that's a turkey track. We do see wild turkeys out there from time to time, but that's not all that we see out there in the way of wildlife. This little pit about the size of a toonie was made by a creature called an antlion. And in the larval stage that you see here, it's interesting in that it buries itself at the bottom of this pit, covers itself with sand, and waits for an insect to come along, usually an ant. And the ant will come to the edge of the pit and it'll say, hey, what's this? And start sliding down the pit because it loses its traction. The antlion, realizing that this thing is coming towards it, it reaches up with the powerful pincers that you see here, grabs the ant, drags it into the sand, and consumes the fluids from that ant. And when it's done with it, it throws the empty carcass up over the edge of the pit and waits for the next customer to come along. And you can always tell how successful an antlion has been by the number of carcasses that are up there on the top of the pit. Now, in the adult stage, they look a little bit like a Dobson fly. They're not very big at all, but that's one of the species of wildlife that does very well out there in the sand. Another one is called a wolf spider, and it makes these little tunnels, vertical tunnels in the sand about the size of a pencil. And while it does not build a web like most spiders do, it does line the inside of that tunnel with webbing to prevent it from collapsing. And it lays there and wait for an insect to come along. And once it does, it races out after the insect, captures it, and drags it down. So life can get pretty terrifying out there on the sand dunes. And this is the wolf spider. We have a lot of wolf spiders in the Bay of Quinte area. This particular one is a little different because it makes these little tunnels in the sand. Now, sandbanks isn't the only sandbar in the area. There are lots of sandbars, as you very well know, all the way up to Weller's Bay. We also, of course, have the Outlet Beach, which is very famous, or infamous, I should say now, given the number of visitors that visited every year. But it's not the only sandbar. There are others. For instance, there's the Hikes Bay bar, which is for the most part predominantly gravel, but it gets sandy as you go further up. And then we have Pleasant Bay, and we have North Beach, and then of course we have the Bald Head Peninsula, or the Weller's Bay provincial, no, it's not provincial, it's national, Weller's Bay National Wildlife Area, which lacks about a kilometer, being the same length as sandbanks. And here are some pictures that I took from the air one day. These are older pictures, but they haven't changed that much. As you can see, this is Pleasant Bay. As you can see, the sandbar down here is very similar to what you find at sandbanks. Same plants, same vegetation, same animals, just on a smaller scale. And then we have North Beach Provincial Park, And we have the Bald Head Peninsula or Wellers Bay National Wildlife Area. This is looking from the channel at Barcove, looking, I guess it would be south. There are a lot of other barrier beaches, but not sand. This is Little Bluff Conservation Area down at South Bay. And there's a beautiful barrier beach down here of gravel. And you can almost see what has happened over the centuries where the incoming waves has closed off what used to be part of Prince Edward Bay and has created this barrier beach. Now, it is that Little Bluff Conservation Area where we begin to realize that there's a lot of history in some of these areas. And I think history factors quite predominantly into what natural history you can find there, such as the wildflowers and the wildlife. It determines a lot what went on in the past, determines what is growing or living there today. Here again, the limestone, this is 60 feet high, and I tend to use imperial measurement. I do swing back and forth, but I'm using imperial measurement from time to time. This is about 60 feet in height above the level of Prince Edward Bay, and the barrier beach is down here below out of sight. And some of the history that, whoops, sorry, I went a little bit too fast here. I'll just go back. There we go. This is what I want to talk about. There's a lot of history here because back in 1860 to 1890, we went through a period called the Barley Days when Prince Edward County was producing thousands of bushels of barley. It was fetching a good price. It was for the brewing of beer in the United States. And there were barley wharves all over the county. One was at Sandbanks, one was here. There was one at Big Island where I live, and they were dotted all over the area. And ships would come in, schooners would load it with barley and take it over to Oswego. So this is the remains of one of the barley storage buildings right at the bottom of Little Bluff Conservation Area. There's actually a trail that goes down there. And some volunteers and I, one year, we spent about a week, I guess, clearing out some of the brush that had grown up in here so that visitors could have a better appreciation for these remains. Now, if we're talking about history, nowhere is this more evident than at Main Duck Island. And I used to do guided tours out to Main Duck Island. It's about 19 kilometers from the tip of Prince Edward County. It actually is technically part of Prince Edward County, but it's owned by Parks Canada. And I used to do guided boat tours out there every week for about 12 years, I guess, over what has been fondly referred to as the graveyard of Lake Ontario because of the storms that occur out there. But we had good luck. Anyway, there's a lot of history out there, a lot of natural history, a lot of cultural history. This is a lighthouse that was built in 1913, which is still there. And I want to draw your attention to this photo down here where my laser pointer is. This is a gravel beach, one of few actually at Main Duck Island. We're standing here about, I'd say 40 feet above the level of Schoolhouse Bay. And this is the same beach that Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip had a private picnic on in 1984 when they were doing a tour of Ontario. It also is the beach that was owned by John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State under Eisenhower. He owned the entire island, as a matter of fact, from about I think it was 1941 until 1959. That's when he passed away. And he had his cabin, which I'll show you the remains of shortly, just to the left of this picture. This is the harbor at Prince Edward Point, and you can imagine, or Prince Edward Point, Main Duck Island. And you can imagine back in the 1920s, rum runners coming in here and waiting for darkness to fall so they could take their illegal booze over to the United States. So certainly a lot of history there. And here's the chimney that went with the cottage or the cabin site that John Foster Dulles owned. This is the old lightkeeper's house. Assistant lightkeeper and the main lightkeeper's house. It's a duplex, and it's, as far as I know, it's still there. I used to take tours through that building. Of course, it's all boarded up. I had to give everyone flashlights to get in, and it's kind of amazing when you think about it that all these materials, the lumber, the cement, the concrete, everything, the lighthouse, all those materials had to be brought over by boat. and that's something to really to ponder. A few buildings are still left on the island. No one lives on the island now because the lighthouse was automated in 1978, so there was no need for anyone to be out there during the shipping season. This is the old net shed where the commercial fishermen worked out of. I think there was a blacksmith shop there too at one time. And this little cottage is no longer there. I won't go into details due to shortage of time with this presentation. There's a lot to cover. This building is no longer here. It's a little cabin that was once owned by Robert Hart. And Robert Hart once owned Main Duck Island after John Foster Dulles had passed away. It was quite livable. I was in it several times. People had been spending the night in there. So it was a quaint little cottage. It was powered by propane and they had all the comforts of home in there. Again, going back to the history, one of the earlier owners of the island was Claude Cole. Claude Cole owned the island until just a few years before John Foster Dulles bought it. Claude Cole had passed away, and his wife held on to it for a few years. But he had some exotic animals out here. Now, these are cattle, as you can see, but these are buffalo. He had some buffalo out there for a while. And if this looks like a black bear down here in the lower right, it is indeed. He had a black bear out there, and he had race horses, and he had all kinds of strange animals. There was a commercial fishery out there that was very important. I think there were about 9 fish shanties. This is looking from the east to the west toward the harbor. This is at the harbor looking in the other direction. And this is the corner of Claude Cole's house. Because Claude Cole owned the island, he of course had a very lavish house. When we did our tours, we were actually following an old roadway that once extended from the harbor at Main Duck Island to the lighthouse. It's a distance of about, here I go, Imperial, or about 2 miles, I guess. And apparently in earlier times, they had a Jeep out there that they would use to get from the harbor area to the lighthouse and back again. So that was the trail that we followed when we did our walking tours out there. This is dated 1985. The lighthouse was automated in 1978, and I don't think that's a mistake in the date on this picture. It's quite probable that while the lighthouse was being automated and things were kind of closing down, that this area was maintained, but the lightkeeper's house was just out of the picture here to the right. So this whole area was meticulously maintained and mowed. They had their own electricity there. They generated it with diesel generators, so it was very well kept up. Now, it doesn't take Mother Nature long to recapture after, the humans have left the island. And this is the way it looks today. In fact, when we did our guided tours out there, I would have to come out with a team of volunteers and we'd have to maintain the trail so that people could walk it easily. And we had to cut our way through all this brush to get to where the lighthouse is. This is the lightkeeper's house here. As you can see, they had all the comforts of home because they had their own diesel generated electricity. And this is the way it looks today. At least I assume it does. I assume it does because I haven't been there since 2012. And when I was there in 2012, the roof was starting to leak quite badly. And there have been rumors going around that Parks Canada were intending to demolish the building in the interest of safety. And it's really sad when you think about it because there's all this history at Main Duck Island with John Foster Dulles owning it and Queen Elizabeth being there and the rum runners. And we had such high hopes for that island. We were going to put up signage and all kinds of things, but it just didn't work out for us. They just couldn't spare the time to do all that. You'd almost have to live there. So whether that building is still there or not, I don't know. But at the time, I did take tours through there with flashlights. I will mention too, just in a matter of interest, there's Main Duck Island. It's right very close to the border, within a kilometer, I think. It's 19 kilometers from here to the island. So it was about a 45-minute boat ride over every time I did a tour. And it's a natural chain of islands that extends over to the United States. We have the Galoo Islands here and Stony Island here, and over here the false ducks. And we can get a closer look at the false ducks here. And I just want to mention that so many people call Sweatman Island False Duck Island, and that's fine. I have no trouble with that. But technically, the two islands together, Timber Island and Sweatman Island, where the lighthouse is, are collectively called the false ducks. Now, getting back to Scotch Bonnet Island again, I just have to pick up something here I dropped. This is a picture I took when I visited there a number of years ago through the courtesy of the Canadian Wildlife Service. And the tower has looked this way for about 20 years, and it just simply refuses to fall. There's the skeleton tower that replaces the old historic tower that was once there. And here's the way the lighthouse used to look and the way it looks today. It's a beautiful place to visit, actually. You just can't roam around too much. You certainly won't take you very long to hike around the island. And while I was there, I took some pictures of the remains of the lighthouse and the lightkeeper's house. Gotta mention double-crested cormorants. You can't do a presentation without mentioning these notorious birds. The reason I threw this picture in is because they are the only species, or one of few species, that nest out there now. In fact, the double-crested cormorants, as you may know, they had a kind of a roller coaster ride as far as populations go. They were down at a very low level, then they bounced back, then they went low again when they were ingesting toxins from the lake, and now they're back up to an all-time high. And I mentioned this slide because this was the first location that double-crested cormorants were found nesting. And the person who found it was author Farley Mowat. So I just thought I'd throw that in as a bit of trivia. There are some herring gulls out there. In fact, studies are being done by the Canadian Wildlife Service to study the mortality out there. This is Chip Weslow on the left, who is now retired from the Canadian Wildlife Service. We still correspond back and forth, and he volunteers yet to do a number of studies, including the banding of great egrets and so forth. Well, while we were out there, he was studying the mortality of the herring gulls, and herring gulls were found to be a good subject because they are a species that stays in the Great Lakes as a rule. During the 12 months of the year, they don't migrate that much. So any toxins that they have picked up must have been picked up locally. So they were particularly interested in the carcasses of the herring gulls, if they found any at all. This is Dave Moore on the right. I'm not quite sure. I've lost contact with him. I just heard from Chip, as a matter of fact, a few days ago. Nicholson Island. Nicholson Island, that's less than a kilometer away from Hikes Point. Wellington is way up in here. It's about let me think now. I think it's around 200 acres, 240 acres, something like that. It's owned by a private hunting club from Toronto who hunt pheasants out there. In past years, they hunted bobwhites and chukars, and it's a put and take strategy that they use. They used to raise a few of them out there, but I think it's just put and take. They raise them elsewhere, they drop them off, and then hunters will hunt them. This is a little landing strip that these some of the hunters who fly in can use. I spent a couple of days out there working on the breeding bird atlas, so I got to know the island quite well. And legendary Bing Crosby, crooner Bing Crosby, spent a day out there hunting pheasants. Now, here we are back at Scotch Bonnet, and it's these dangerous shoals that rise above the level of Lake Ontario, as well as other shoals that are sort of half hidden under the surface of the water, that resulted in many early ships, like schooners, for instance, being destroyed. And these locations were all marked by lighthouses. This one was built in 1871, I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, but all were constructed roughly during the same period. and you can see with this aerial shot that I took one day, and there's quite a humorous story. This is Salmon Point. You can see these dangerous shoals underneath that ships would have encountered before present day navigational means. I was doing an aerial tour, and it was a very windy day. I was quite surprised that the pilot decided to take us up that day, and he said, no, we'll be fine. And we got to Salmon Point, and I said, could you bank the plane just a little bit so that I can get the shot of Salmon Point? And as soon as he did that, a gust of wind kind of shook the plane violently, and just by accident, I clicked the shutter, and this is what I came up with. And I've taken pictures of this several times since and have never come up with as good a picture as this. So, you know, out of 1,000 pictures, you do end up with a half decent picture. Well, anyway, these dangerous shoals have resulted in about 100 shipwrecks around the county, particularly down in this area here. 60 of them have been documented. The majority of them off Prince Edward Point and Main Duck Island, which is called the graveyard of Lake Ontario, or the Marysburg Vortex, it's often called, where the waters can get very rough as a result of it narrowing up here and the prevailing winds creating quite a high wave action. We've had some fun trips out there. So wherever you go, you see limestone rocks. I don't believe this Flower Pot Island exists anymore, but at the time this picture was taken by the late Court Knox, and it was standing, but I think it has collapsed since. One very impressive structure is about 100 feet high. It's down at what we call the Rock, or Cape Vesey. The highway would be way up here, County Road 8. You can't see it. And you can't see it from the road, but you can certainly see it by boat. So we have some impressive limestone features in the county, and a couple or three falls that are quite impressive. This is Jackson's Falls, just east of Milford. And the most remarkable formation, of course, is Lake on the Mountain. A lot of myths and legends surrounding Lake on the Mountain. It is one of three similar lakes in the county, and I'll just touch on those briefly. This is believed, or at least it was believed, to be what is known geologically as a collapsed dolmen. That's where through erosion and water running underneath from springs and so forth, that eventually the roof of the formation dropped in on itself and formed this deep basin of about, I think it's around 109 feet deep. And it rises about 200 feet or more above the level of the Bay of Quinte that you see over here. I don't know what the current belief is as to how this formed, but when I was doing tours, I always said it was a collapsed dolmen, and everyone went away happy. I'm just checking my notes here, trying to see if I did have anything about the current beliefs, but I don't see anything here. Some used to believe that it was fed by a mysterious stream from Lake Erie, I think it was. Of course, there's no truth to that. There are some springs around the outside, and there's lots of incoming streams. There's a wetland way off here to the left, so there's lots of water for sure. And there are some two other similar lakes, and you got to wonder, were these created the same way? Because they're sort of on the edge of the escarpment that runs along the north edge of the county. Roblin Lake, of course, at Ameliasburg, and Fish Lake a little farther in, but not that far from the escarpment. Certainly gives rise to some thought on the formation of these little basins. And you can see them. And there's the northern edge of the escarpment right here. So you can see that even Fish Lake isn't that far away. And that northern edge continues on down. And it's, you know, if you're driving around the county, you know you have a high cliff all along the north shore of the county and extending right down to Prince Edward Point. What you may also know too, if you visit sandbanks in any of the areas along the south shore, that the south side of the county actually is level with Lake Ontario. So geologically, I always refer to this as a lopsided layer cake, and Main Duck Island is exactly the same way. Let's talk about swamps. And there is a difference between swamps and marshes. Swamps are not marshes and marshes are not swamps, and yet you hear the two terms being interchanged quite readily. One typical swamp is the big swamp. It's huge. It's, I think, over 2,000 acres in size. A swamp is defined as a wet area dominated by trees, no cattails to speak of, all trees. It's a flooded area. So the big swamp would be a good example. But there are other swamps too. The Albury Swamp along Regnersville Road is a good example. And this is more or less a man-made swamp down off Charwell Point off Army Reserve Road. It's quite huge. And these dead trees once attracted over 250 nesting great blue herons. You can see some nests over here. And over time, a lot of these trees did topple over and the herons moved elsewhere. So that entire South Shore area has a lot of interesting aspects about it. Now, marshes, on the other hand, are dominated by cattails. This is one of the largest ones in the county, the Saugwin Marsh. This is looking east from Highway 62 towards Huff's Island. We have Muscogee Bay and the Bay of Quinte up here, and Big Island in the distance where I live. And the Big Island Marsh, it's about 2,000 acres in size, a very important marsh. And not as large, but no less important, is the Cressy Marsh down at Cressy. And we have the Bloomfield Marsh. And wherever you have cattail marshes, you have almost an entire different makeup of species. And one of the more common ones, other than the red-winged blackbird, is the marsh wren. Now I want to take you to the South Shore Important Bird Area. This is the southern peninsula in Prince Edward County, and it's very important from the aspect of bird migration. When birds migrate across Lake Ontario from the south, where they winter in the tropics, and they're heading north to more northern breeding grounds, they must travel across Lake Ontario. And they're seeking the first point of land that they can find in order to drop down and rest and feed for a while and gorge themselves and get their bellies full before they continue their journey northward. And here we have a good example of that. This has been identified as the South Shore Important Bird Area, and the area designated is by this black line. So it takes in the entire south shore of the county and up into Soup Harbor at Point Peter, and includes South Bay. So all this area is very important from the standpoint of bird migration, because this is where they must stop and feed. But there is evidence, and I have seen this evidence myself, where they may land here, but they sort of work their way down and they come to Prince Edward Point, which is here, where sometimes there will be what we call fallow. There will be millions of birds in all these trees that you see here. And of course, when you have that many birds, you have birders coming to enjoy the spectacle. It actually is rivaled only by Point Pelee. In 1978, it was recognized by the Canadian Wildlife Service to have significant importance to bird migration. So it was designated a Prince Edward Point National Wildlife Area. I think there are about 1,500 acres altogether. My memory serves me correct. And of course, you will get birders. These are some pictures I took during one of my guided bird hikes down there of people doing what birders like to do, look up in the trees. To give you an idea of where some of these people are coming from, this man and his son came from Ottawa. This young man was from Syracuse. So it's not unusual to see license plates from as far away as Ohio and Pennsylvania and Illinois and New York, of course. And where you have birds, it didn't surprise anyone to see the Prince Edward Point Bird Observatory be set up in, I guess it was the late 1970s. And at first, the building was so small, it was barely large enough to walk in and back out. But the Canadian Wildlife Service a couple years ago built this beautiful, gorgeous building that provides the bird banders and volunteers with a lot more room to get in there and do their thing and band birds. And they band thousands of birds every year, and always draws a crowd. Never used to see anybody at Prince Edward Point. Now you do. And I should mention that a lot of the birds that are going through are members of the warbler family. These little birds, and they're not much bigger, well, they're not even as big in some cases as sparrows. And these birds have traveled all the way from northern South America, worked their way northward, cross Lake Ontario, and a lot of them are heading further north to the boreal forests where they will nest. And it is really, I don't know, it just blows me away to think that these birds that are now in Prince Edward County in the spring, mid-May usually is when they arrive, that just a few days earlier, they were rubbing shoulders with tropical bananaquits and motmots and all kinds of tropical birds down there. So this is a Blackburnian warbler. This is a chestnut-sided warbler. And these are just some of over 35 species that pass through every spring during a 2 or 3 week period in May. Black-throated blue warbler. So you get some really dazzling colors down there, especially when you get 20 or 30 species of warblers all intermingling together. The most important part of the banding season down at Prince Edward Point is, of course, the northern saw-whet owl banding. And it was found to be an important staging area for northern saw-whet owls back in 1975, I think it was. So banding has been taking place ever since during September and October. 2007 was a record year. We banded between 1,500 and 1,600 northern saw-whet owls, and turned out to be the highest total in all of North America. And so we're just now beginning to understand where these owls have nested, where they are migrating to through recoveries of these bands that people find in their, as they're wandering around. They may find a saw-whet owl dead and they'll turn in the band, and we can tell from that where it was banded and how far it has gone and where it is wintered. So, and I'm not done yet. We have looked at discussing our natural heritage. We have just scratched the surface. There's so many different places that I could mention, so many different aspects of the county, but I could only touch on a few of these. And I'm sure everyone has heard what an impact the popularity of tourism this past year has had on Prince Edward County, with just enormous numbers of visitors. And I don't think it's going to decrease anytime soon. This is Sandbanks. This is Outlet Beach. This was back in 1980. This is when I worked there. And we thought we had a super year if we had between 300 and 350,000 people, maybe 380,000 people during the season. And this was a typical day on the beach. In more recent years, the last 7 or 8 years, that number has risen to 700 to 800,000 people per year. Earlier, I mentioned about the damage that had been done to the sand dunes due to the trampling of cattle. We don't have cattle on the dunes now, but we have all these people. And you've got to wonder, is the same thing going to start happening again at Sandbanks? If the sand is just going to surrender under all these feet? It's hard to say. We certainly hope not. We look at a beach like at Little Bluff Conservation Area. This was a beach that my late wife and I would go to in the summer on a hot summer day and see nary a soul. This past year, Quinte Conservation, who owns the property, had to close Little Bluff Conservation Area because it was just being invaded too much by visitors. It was crazy. I mean, there was garbage everywhere. There was illegal camping. There was overcrowding and yes, even human excrement. So it was a very sad situation, to be sure. Another beach is another one that my wife and I used to go to down at Prince Edward Point. Because of its isolation, you never saw anybody there in the summertime. This past year, I went down there this summer one day, and you couldn't park anywhere. There were cars on both sides of the road. This same beach that you're seeing here was just packed with beach umbrellas and people, and yes, garbage. So it's very sad. But it's not just overcrowding of people. We have concerns about invasive plants in the area, such as we've heard a lot about purple loosestrife, dog strangling vine, buckthorn, um, garlic mustard. It just seems every year there's a new one coming along. So this is a familiar scene at Weller's Bay, where in the last number of years, I have seen another invasive plant take over the area, and that's Phragmites. Now, this area, if you were happen to listen to Mark Seguin's excellent presentation that he gave a number, I guess it was last year, perhaps, to the Friends, where he described how this area was gouged out naturally by what he called an ice shelf. I think it was 1856 or somewhere in there. It gouged out this channel quite naturally with the prevailing westerlies, sending the ice flows and gouging out this channel, which was about 14 feet deep, I think, and 150 feet wide. So that channel remained for many, many years. We visited the site in 2004, I guess it was. I did a kayak tour up there. It was shallow, but you could still get through, no problem. 4 years later, this is what I came upon. This is all Phragmites. It's about 12 feet high, growing here. And this is not the channel. This is part of Weller's Bay. The channel, I never did find it. It's somewhere in here, buried. So Phragmites, terribly invasive plant, has taken over. And I've also noticed areas in Weller's Bay, or at least I did back then, where it had actually formed its own little colonies, little islands along the shallows. So, you know, we have reason to worry about this invasive plant. Now, last slide. I hope everyone is still awake. There is some positive side though, and I always like to think positive. We are making great strides in protecting our natural heritage, and this is one area that is certainly getting some protection. This is the South Shore Important Bird Area again. There are several areas looking back. This is the area that was purchased by the Canadian Wildlife Service, the Prince Edward Point National Wildlife Area. So it's protected. These two cream-colored areas are owned by the Ministry of Natural Resources. This is the Ostrander Point Crown Land Block, and this is the Point Peter Provincial Wildlife Area. And these areas works are underway to redesignate these as conservation reserves. Don't confuse that with conservation areas. That's something totally different. As conservation reserves, all we're trying to do is to prevent any development from taking place along this critical shoreline, because this is the only basically uninhabited shoreline that we have in all of Prince Edward County. So we want to preserve it. And that doesn't mean that we're going to ban hunting and ban ATVing or anything like that. I feel that there's room for everybody down there. But here's some other areas. This is the Hastings Prince Edward Land Trust purchased this. It's the Miller Family Nature Reserve. It's a beautiful area. A couple here purchased by the Nature Conservancy of Canada, which is the Maple Cross coastline off Helmer Road that goes along in here, parallel with the road at South Bay. And then this little narrow strip of land, which is the Hudson Rose Nature Reserve, including the historic Hudson Rose log house that I guess there's going to be some renovations done to it this year if all goes well. And there's also another little area down here called the Bass Family Nature Reserve. I don't know too much about that one. What I mentioned earlier, McMahon Bluff, this area was actually donated last year by the owner to the Nature Conservancy of Canada, which is really good news. So there's a lot of positive things going on. And with that, I am going to say thank you very much. And if there are any questions, I would be happy to try to address them.
Thanks so much, Terry. There are a couple of questions in the chat box, and I'll just review those. One excuse me, was looking for, can you still visit Main Duck Island?
Absolutely. There's no problem at all. Just let me stop the share here. Absolutely. There's no problem at all visiting Main Duck Island. Parks Canada very seldom visit the area. There are tons and tons of boaters over there in the summertime. You can certainly visit it anytime you want if you dare go across that stretch of water. You have to have a pretty good boat to do that. But, oh yeah, everyone's welcome.
Wonderful. And the skeleton tower you talked about, what's the purpose of that? Karen was wondering.
Well, the skeleton tower just replaces the former lighthouse. It has a light on the top, so it serves as a lighthouse in a skeletal form.
And at South Shore, are there well-marked trails at that area?
Not really. There are the remains of old roads. Of course, the military back during the Second World War, they had totally decimated the area, to serve their purposes, and had created a few roadways, and ATVs have created their own. So yeah, there's lots of places to walk. Charwell Point is a very important area to visit, and you can actually drive it if you have a four-wheel drive. I say four-wheel drive because some of the dips down in there are pretty deep. I have driven an ordinary car down there with no problems at all. But there are roadways, remnants of old roadways, roadways that are still being maintained to some degree. And lots of trails. Oh yeah, there's no problem at all.
Fantastic. Colleen is also curious about the geology of the island at Wapoos.
I've actually, to tell you the truth, I've only been to Wapoos Island once, and that was on the shoreline when I was doing something for the I forgot. It wasn't Boy Scouts. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So I didn't get a chance to roam the island, but I suspect strongly that it's very much the same as what you would find elsewhere, limestone with a very thin layer of soil on top, maybe a little deeper in places, because I think there was some agriculture happening out there back, but I would suspect it's about the same as many of the other islands, very shallow soil.
Thanks for that. Does anybody else have any questions? Feel free at this time to type again in the chat, or you can unmute if you'd prefer to just voice your question. And of course, if you have questions for Terry afterwards, he's welcomed you to email him. You can contact him through his website. And I'm seeing a new message come in. What have we got here? Can you still visit Main Duck Island? Oh, yeah. Sorry, Helma. Yeah.
Oh, hello, Helma. I know you well. Yeah, sure. You can visit Main Duck Island anytime you want. It's just a kind of a rough trip over there. There's no place to land a plane. There used to be historically a landing strip there. But as one of the lighthouse keepers who has since passed away, Cole Main, told me, he says, it was a good runway, but you had to really rev up your engine to clear the trees at the other end. So you certainly can't land there today, but you can certainly go out there and visit the island by boat, and feel free to roam around like everyone else does. It's incredibly busy in the summertime.
Ken's wondering if there's public access to the sandbar at Pleasant Bay.
That's kind of questionable. The way I always accessed it was from North Beach Road. There is a gateway there, and I've always parked along the side of the road, but you have to walk up quite a distance to get to the actual sand dunes. It's a lovely place. It's quite peaceful and quite quiet because not too many people take the trouble to walk up that distance. But as far as parking, it may be a little questionable. I know there are bylaws in place that supposedly prevent you from parking along the roadside, but I've always done so without any problems at all. And I feel if you get off the road far enough, there shouldn't be any issues at all.
Yeah, and just to let everybody know too, there's a bit of a drive down Baker Road that'll take you past the landfill site there and around, and there's a beach access down that way. Again, both North Beach Road and Baker Road, though, are subject to the new bylaw restrictions, which means I think the bylaw was if you're parking there on weekends or holidays, you're subject to up to a $400 fine. And so it is in place because a lot of traffic is now going to those locations, and the residents are not getting access to those roads. And more importantly, emergency services may not be able to get down those roads with the just the number of vehicles we're seeing there now.
Good point.
So many beautiful areas to visit, though, beaches and forest areas, marsh, so many different things to see around here.
I just want to make a comment. I was going to do this at the start, but I didn't want to take too much time, but I feel that I can work it in now. When I first did this presentation, it was back in 2008, and I hadn't really been out in the public at all to do this presentation. And I think its maiden voyage was actually at Kenty Public School. And I was asked to be one of many speakers that day. And this, I thought, oh my God, if I go through it like an auctioneer, it's still going to take 45 minutes. And here we have these grade 6, 7, and 8 sitting on a hard wood floor in the gymnasium. How am I going to keep their interest? Well, that was not a big problem at all. I did okay. It went over very well. But I asked through the school if the students could give me some feedback on what they found interesting, what they enjoyed the most, any areas that were hideously boring, so I could adjust the slideshow. So I got a lot of comments back, and they were all very charitable. They all enjoyed it. And this one grade 8 student, he said, I enjoyed it very much. I enjoyed the part about the Ameliasburg Inlier because, that's right where I live. And I also enjoyed Main Duck Island and Sandbanks Park. In fact, he said, and this is the sentence that got me, his comment. He said it was the only presentation that I was able to sit through and stay awake. So I thought that was pretty charitable. High praise indeed. Okay, we had a question here. I can't remember what it was now about I guess the list of invasive plants, I think was the question.
Yeah, re-mention the invasive plant species that we're currently invading.
Okay, it's going to be by memory. The Phragmites, of course. Historically, it was always purple loosestrife, but it seems that once you get a natural control, which purple loosestrife, or any invasive species for that matter, never has, once you get that natural control, then it's no longer a major concern. And in the case of purple loosestrife, it was an insect, Galarucella is the Latin name of it. Again, by memory. I'm surprised at my age I can remember that name. It's an insect that feeds on purple loosestrife. So it's no longer the concern that it once was, but historically it was. So following that, there was garlic mustard is another one. Dog strangling vine is perhaps the worst right now. Down at Prince Edward Point, it just completely covered the fields at one time, and Canadian Wildlife Service went down there to control it, and they did a marvelous job of doing it. But then up came the garlic mustard, which has been laying dormant. So you win one war and you have another one come up. European buckthorn, I think, was the other one I mentioned. But there are lots of invasive plants out there, but those are the ones that come to mind.
Regarding the Phragmites, where did those first come in from?
Oh dear. It is sold. I think it was brought over as an ornamental plant and escaped that way. Now, I could be wrong. I stand to be corrected. But a lot of these invasive plants were brought in as ornamental plants, and they just took off from there. A lot of plants have done that. I think burdock, for instance, which we can relate to. It's been around for centuries. I think it was brought here. It's not a native plant. So I'm just guessing with the Phragmites.
Thanks so much, Terry. I think that covers the questions in the chats. Again, if anybody wants to reach out to Terry on his website at naturestuff.net, hereafter or get a hold of them, there's a contact form them. What's next for you, Terry? What do you have coming up for projects?
I'm writing a book. Is that what you're looking for?
Sure. Yeah. Could you tell us about that?
Oh, it's a book on it's called Growing Up Big Island. It's a kind of a sequel to another book I did back in 2011 called Up Before 5, The Family Farm. So this one takes a more intense look at what it was like as a child growing up on Big Island and some of the things we did and how farming was done back in those days and the responsibilities we had and so forth. And it's been an exciting project. And I'm also including my late wife's offerings that she wrote on her hometown of Coe Hill, Ontario, which is south of Bancroft. And she wrote some great stories that she'd hoped one day to get printed, but they never did. So we're putting her stories at the back of the book, but inverting them, and she'll have her own separate cover. So when you get done with one half of the book, you flip the book over and read the other half. So, so it's an interesting project. I hope to have it done in time for it to be on the bookshelves by Christmas, I hope, if everything goes well.
Fantastic. I know we'll be watching for that. Thanks, Terry. Karen,
again, if anyone wants to email me, feel free to email me with any questions that you may think of later on. Thanks, Helma. I do guided tours once in a while to Glenwood Cemetery.
And Terry, we can find those on your website. Is that like when you're doing tours?
I hope so. The reason I say that is the website you had up earlier is my brand new website, and I'm learning a whole new editing program on WordPress. And I hope to get more actively involved in getting these events up where people can see them. At the moment, the only thing that's up reliably is the Quinte Area Bird Report, which is up every Friday. But I hope to keep improving the website as it goes along.
Great. Well, if we have no more questions for Terry, I just want to express our thanks on behalf of Friends of Wellers Bay, our membership, and all the others who joined in today for a great presentation, Terry. That was really interesting, and I hear you that there's so much more to learn about our area, and you did scratch the surface very, very well, though. And I know my interest is certainly piqued to learn more about some of these different areas that you've talked about. So again, thank you so much for this. As we mentioned, this is going to be posted onto our website and our social media channels once it's available, so that if you know anyone who might be interested in watching it, or you'd like to watch it again, by all means, please take a look for that. And I hope everyone enjoyed it, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and take care and keep well, and all the best. Thank you.
Well, I certainly hope you can edit out all the O's and Ah's and mistakes I made.
It was a fabulous presentation, Terry. Very, very interesting. Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, and there's Christy. Yes, there's your four-legged furry friend that you take with you everywhere.
Yeah, she's the star of Facebook.
Yes, that's for sure. That's awesome. Thank you.
On that note, thanks everyone again for coming out today. Don't hesitate to check us out on our friendsofwellersbay.org website. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram. And we just look forward to hearing from you. If you have ideas about what kinds of functions we could perform in the future, great guest speaker ideas, let us know. And you can also find that presentation on our website, as well as follow us on our YouTube channel, where this video will be posted in the near future. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. was good.